My friend left the room, and suddenly, it was just her and me. She closed the door and whispered, "We have time." The day started innocuously enough. I had gone over to my friend's house under the pretense of helping him with a project. I expected the usual chaos of a living room strewn with papers and the clatter of someone scrambling through assignments. But instead, the house was quiet, almost still. My friend had just stepped out for a phone call, promising to be back in a few minutes. That's when I noticed her, his older sister, standing in the doorway, casual yet impossibly graceful. She was wearing a simple, well-fitted outfit that somehow made the room feel warmer. Her hair caught the sunlight streaming through the window, highlighting the subtle waves, and the faint scent of her perfume. Something soft, floral, a hint of vanilla, brushed past me as she stepped closer. I felt a strange shift in the air, like the world had narrowed down to the space between us. "Hey," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Before I could respond, she moved with that quiet confidence that older women seem to carry naturally, closing the door behind us. The click of the latch echoed in the empty house and instantly focused my attention. Her words were deliberate, slow. "We have time." The phrase hung in the air, simple yet loaded with implication. I froze for a fraction of a second, unsure if I was imagining the undercurrent beneath her casual tone. My mind raced, weighing propriety against the unexpected thrill of being alone with her. Something about the way she leaned slightly against the doorframe, the subtle tilt of her head, made it clear that this was no ordinary encounter. I shifted on my feet, aware of the space between us, roughly 5 feet but somehow feeling smaller. Every movement I made seemed louder than it should, the shuffle of my sneakers on the floor, the creak of the chair as I adjusted my posture. My eyes caught hers, and there was a flicker there. Curiosity, amusement, perhaps something more. It was a fleeting connection, but enough to make my stomach tighten with anticipation. She smiled then, just a little, and it was the kind of smile that makes you pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew about someone. It wasn't flirtatious in the way movies often show, but warm and knowing, an invitation without words. I noticed the subtle details. The way her sleeve brushed against her wrist, the graceful curve of her posture, the calm confidence in the way she moved. Every tiny gesture seemed amplified in the quiet room. And then, just as I was about to speak, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes holding mine for an extra heartbeat longer than comfortable. It was a silent challenge and an unspoken question all at once. In that moment, I realized that this encounter was not random. It was deliberate, and it mattered. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from the awareness that something rare and fragile had begun to stir. A slow, quiet tension that neither of us had to name yet to feel. By the time my friend returned, I knew something had shifted irreversibly. The door had closed, yes, but it had also opened something far more potent. The first hint of a connection that would linger, unspoken, charged with possibility. And all I could do was stand there, aware of her presence, wondering how much of this was chance and how much was the start of something I had no idea how to navigate. The room felt different now, quieter, smaller somehow, like the walls had drawn closer without either of us noticing. After that first charged moment with the door closed behind us, the awkwardness began to ease, replaced by a gentle curiosity that neither of us could ignore. We settled near the window, where the late afternoon sunlight poured in, dust motes drifting lazily in the golden light. It was warm, soft, and intimate, the perfect backdrop for conversations that had the potential to linger in memory. We started with small talk at first, the kind of light chatter that might seem trivial to an outsider. But every sentence carried an unspoken weight. I found myself noticing the way her hands moved as she spoke. Graceful, precise, gestures that felt natural but hypnotic to watch. When she laughed, it wasn't loud or performative, just a quiet, melodic sound that made me lean in slightly, hoping to catch every nuance. There was a rhythm to her speech, a subtle cadence that made me hang on to even the most mundane details of her day. She asked me about my work, my studies, and I spoke honestly, more openly than I had expected. There was a comfort in her presence, a sense that she genuinely wanted to hear, to understand. And yet, beneath that warmth, there was an edge of teasing, a faint smile playing at her lips whenever I hesitated or stumbled over my words. It was playful, intimate, but never overbearing. I felt both seen and gently tested, as though she were allowing me glimpses of herself while keeping a graceful distance. As she reached for her cup of tea, our hands brushed. A fleeting touch, light as a whisper, but enough to make my pulse stutter. It wasn't accidental. I could sense the deliberation behind it. My awareness of her presence sharpened instantly. The faint scent of her perfume, mingled with the aroma of tea, seemed to wrap around me, grounding me in the moment while simultaneously pulling me in. Every tiny movement, the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the softness of her gaze, became impossible to ignore. I noticed how she leaned slightly forward when she told a story, the way her eyes held mine a moment longer than necessary. And yet, she respected boundaries naturally, maintaining a grace that made every pause and glance feel significant. It was a delicate dance, one we didn't need to choreograph but somehow executed intuitively. My thoughts kept circling back to the quiet tension in the air, that magnetic pull that neither of us named but both of us felt keenly. By the time our conversation drifted to lighter topics, favorite books, music, small confessions from childhood, the intimacy had deepened without words. There was a subtle trust building between us, a fragile bridge of understanding and curiosity. I realized, with a thrill I tried to suppress, that this connection was not fleeting. It had weight, and it had meaning. As she laughed again, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, our hands met briefly over the edge of the table. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything we were both too cautious to say aloud. Curiosity, attraction, the quiet acknowledgment of a bond forming in real time. And in that golden light, with soft shadows playing across her features, I understood that something delicate and profound had begun. A connection that would linger long after the door opened again. The conversation that day had shifted effortlessly from casual to personal, though neither of us announced the change. There was a warmth in the air, a gentle hum that made even the ordinary feel intimate. She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but elegant, and for a moment, I found myself studying her with quiet fascination. Her eyes, warm and thoughtful, seemed to flicker with memories, and I realized she wasn't just smiling at my words. She was remembering, reflecting, allowing me a glimpse into her world. It began with small confessions. I admitted a clumsy childhood mishap, a memory I'd always found embarrassing. She laughed softly, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement, her hand brushing over her lips in that unconscious, effortless way that made my chest tighten. Then she shared a story of her own, a youthful mistake, a moment of vulnerability she rarely recounted. The room felt smaller with every sentence, the golden sunlight turning ordinary details into vivid impressions. Her honesty had a magnetic quality. I noticed the subtle gestures that accompanied it, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the slight shrug of her shoulders when she laughed at herself, the glint in her eyes when she recounted something slightly daring. There was a playful edge to her openness, as if she was inviting me closer, testing the boundaries without speaking them aloud. We laughed together, a quiet, shared rhythm that felt almost conspiratorial. I realized how natural it was to let my guard down in her presence. There was no judgment, only curiosity and warmth, and the intimacy was disarming. Our words wove between teasing and sincere reflection, a delicate balance that left both of us leaning slightly closer, subconsciously shortening the distance that the room had once imposed. And then came the subtle touches. Accidental, intentional, I couldn't tell. Our hands brushed as we reached for our drinks. My fingers lingered, and I felt the warmth radiate through my skin, a quiet jolt of awareness that made me acutely conscious of her nearness. She didn't pull away. Her glance held mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgment of the tension simmering beneath the laughter. I noticed more details than ever before. The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the sunlight, the softness of her voice when she recounted a small triumph, the way her laughter changed when she was genuinely amused versus when she was teasing. It was intoxicating in the most subtle way, a quiet gravitational pull that had nothing to do with superficial attraction and everything to do with emotional resonance. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the room in amber and rose, there was a quiet understanding between us. We had shared fragments of our inner lives, small vulnerabilities wrapped in humor and honesty, and it had drawn us together in ways neither of us had anticipated. I realized then that what had started as casual curiosity had evolved into something far more profound, a connection that held the promise of intimacy, unspoken yet undeniable. As she smiled one last time before pausing to sip her tea, her fingers lightly brushing mine again, I understood. This was no fleeting moment. This was the beginning of a slow burn that neither of us wanted to name too quickly, but both of us already felt in the bones. The playful vulnerability had opened a door, and neither of us would want to step away from it. The room fell into a quiet lull that afternoon, the kind of silence that feels alive rather than empty. We had talked, laughed, shared little confessions, and yet, as the words trailed off, an unspoken awareness settled between us. It was heavier than before, charged with something neither of us had dared to name. The sunlight slanted through the window at a sharp angle, catching in her hair and illuminating the soft curve of her jaw. I found my gaze lingering, almost against my will, and I realized she was doing the same. We sat across from each other, ostensibly talking, yet the conversation had softened into background noise. Every movement, every glance, every small gesture seemed amplified. When she reached for a book on the nearby shelf, her fingers brushed mine as she handed it over, and my pulse skipped a beat. It was almost imperceptible, just a brush of skin. Yet the warmth lingered, tracing invisible lines across my consciousness. Neither of us commented, and that silence said more than words ever could. I became hyper-aware of everything about her. The tilt of her head as she considered a page, the subtle catch in her breath when our hands touched, the way her shoulders relaxed when I laughed at something she said. She radiated confidence, yet there was vulnerability beneath it, a quiet openness that drew me in. And I felt it too, a tension that was electric, unspoken, hovering just beneath casual gestures and polite smiles. There were moments when our eyes met, holding for a fraction longer than necessary, and in those fleeting seconds, I felt both a thrill and a hesitation. I wanted to reach across the table, to close the distance, but some quiet part of me reminded me to wait, to savor this moment of closeness before it became something we had to define. She mirrored me instinctively, a subtle lean forward when I did, a slight shift in posture, a softening of expression. The distance between us shrank in those small, unconscious movements, the air itself vibrating with potential energy. Even ordinary objects became conduits for connection. The book, the cup of tea, the sunlight falling across the room. Each seemed to carry meaning, charged by the weight of proximity. My mind spun with possibilities, but her calm composure reminded me that this was a slow burn, not a moment to rush. The tension was deliberate, mutual, and unspoken, a magnetic force pulling us closer without a single word acknowledging it. There was also the awareness of social boundaries, the age difference, the familial connection through my friend, the quiet rules of propriety, and yet it only heightened the intensity. Every accidental touch, every shared laugh, every glance became a delicate negotiation of desire and restraint. We were both walking a line, aware of the stakes, yet unable to ignore the pull that had been building since the door closed behind us. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized that this moment, this unspoken tension, was the real connection, the invisible thread binding us together. We hadn't said anything overt, and yet the room was thick with meaning. I felt both exhilarated and terrified by the intimacy of silence, the way proximity alone had transformed ordinary gestures into something electric. In that quiet space, I knew this was only the beginning. The slow, deliberate dance of closeness and restraint had just begun, and neither of us wanted it to end. If you like, I can expand Keynote 5 next, where emotional vulnerability peaks and the first tentative acknowledgement of desire emerges, keeping it subtle and YouTube-friendly. Do you want me to continue with that? Expand Keynote 5, 500 words. Absolutely. Here's an expanded version of Keynote 5, 500 words, where emotional vulnerability peaks and the first tentative acknowledgement of desire emerges, keeping the slow burn tension and YouTube-safe intimacy. Part 5. Confession of feelings. Tentative, expanded. The room had shifted once again, though neither of us had moved. The golden light of late afternoon now softened into the gentle amber of early evening, casting long shadows across the furniture and highlighting every subtle movement between us. I could feel it in the quiet moments, the way the air seemed to thrum with anticipation, the way even my own breathing felt too loud in the stillness. She sat across from me, calm and composed, but I could see it in the slight parting of her lips, the flicker of her eyes. She felt it too. I tried to focus on the conversation, the trivialities of our day, the mundane anecdotes, but my mind kept circling back to her presence. Every subtle gesture, every laugh, every tilt of her head felt like it was meant for me. My pulse raced, and I realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the quiet tension between us had shifted into something more tangible. I had been aware of it before, but now I could no longer deny it. And so, almost without thinking, I let it slip. My voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant, but deliberate. I admitted something I hadn't allowed myself to voice until that moment. That I was drawn to her, in ways I couldn't fully understand, ways that went beyond admiration or casual affection. The words felt vulnerable on my tongue, yet liberating. It was a confession wrapped in caution, a tentative offering of my feelings without demanding a response. Her eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of surprise that quickly softened into something warmer. She didn't speak immediately, and the pause that followed was long enough to feel infinite. My heart hammered in my chest as I waited, afraid I had misread the moment, afraid I had crossed a line. And yet, when she finally responded, her voice was calm, measured but tender. She acknowledged the connection between us, not with outright affirmation, but with a quiet understanding that left no room for doubt. There was a moment of silence after her words, but it was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with possibility, a shared acknowledgement that neither of us could unsee what had begun to develop. I noticed the way her hand hovered near mine, almost imperceptibly, and how the warmth of her presence seemed to fill the space between us. Our eyes met, lingering, speaking volumes in the language of glances and subtle gestures that words could never capture. I became acutely aware of every detail. The gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed, the soft light playing across her hair, the warmth radiating from her hand just a fraction of an inch from mine. It was electric in the quietest way, a tension that was at once thrilling and terrifying. The unspoken agreement hung between us. We were exploring something fragile and profound, cautiously, deliberately, and without need for rush. By the time the sun had slipped behind the horizon, leaving the room bathed in a dim, intimate glow, the first tentative bridge had been built. I knew that this acknowledgement, quiet, subtle, almost reverent, was the beginning of a deeper connection. The slow burn had shifted into a shared awareness of desire, tempered by caution and mutual respect. It was delicate, fragile, and alive. And for the first time, I realized that neither of us won. The warmth of the evening had settled over the room, soft and unassuming. Yet within that gentle glow, the intensity of our connection lingered like an unspoken promise. After the tentative confession of feelings, a quiet distance fell between us. Not cold, but reflective, almost sacred. The energy that had crackled between us in earlier hours had not dissipated. Rather, it had transformed into something heavier, a tension mingled with contemplation. We both seemed aware of it. I found myself watching her quietly, noticing how she moved across the room to place a book back on the shelf, her fingers brushing the edge of the table in a gesture that somehow seemed deliberate. Her presence had become a focal point of my awareness. Every subtle shift in posture, every flicker of expression seemed magnified in my mind. And yet, with this closeness came hesitation. I could not ignore the boundaries. The age difference, my friendship with her brother, the social expectations that whispered caution into every thought. She too seemed reflective, Her gaze would drift to the window, out toward the dimming light, as if seeking answers from the fading day. Occasionally, our eyes would meet, and in those brief moments, the weight of what we were navigating became tangible. There was curiosity there, yes, but also caution, a delicate understanding that we were treading into territory both thrilling and complex. The silent pauses stretched, yet they were far from uncomfortable. Instead, they felt like a careful dance, one we performed instinctively, mirroring each other's subtle shifts in proximity and focus. Even ordinary touches carried new meaning. A hand resting briefly on a cup of tea, fingers brushing as we both reached for it. These small gestures became charged with significance. I was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the quiet rhythm that matched the pulse in my own veins. It was as though every ordinary motion held a secret weight, a coded language of attention, attraction, and restraint. We spoke occasionally, but the words were measured, reflective, almost philosophical, sharing hopes, regrets, and small truths about our lives. There was no need to force the romantic conversation. Instead, intimacy grew in these subtle, sincere exchanges. Her laughter remained soft, her teasing gentle, yet it now carried a layer of unspoken tension, a playful acknowledgment of the connection that neither of us fully addressed. In my mind, I replayed every interaction, analyzing her gestures, her glances, the pauses that lingered just long enough to matter. And yet, there was no impatience, no rush, only the awareness that something rare and fragile was unfolding, and that it demanded care. We were both exploring, quietly, cautiously, savoring the delicate balance of desire, respect, and social propriety. As the evening deepened, the room grew dim, shadows stretching across the floor. I realized that the connection we had built was not measured by proximity alone but by understanding. The way we held space for each other, the way silence spoke as loudly as words. Hesitation had become a conduit for reflection, and reflection had deepened our bond, making the eventual closeness all the more significant. The slow burn was far from over. If anything, it had grown more intense, threaded with both longing and restraint, and I knew that whatever came next would need careful, deliberate steps. To step away from it. The room had grown quiet again, but this time it was different. Not a reflective pause like before, but a gentle stillness, filled with possibility. The golden glow of evening light had faded into a soft, muted hue, and the subtle shadows across the floor mirrored the complexity of what had developed between us. All the playful teasing, subtle touches, and lingering glances of the past hours had led to this moment, the point where hesitation gave way to clarity, where emotion finally found its voice. We sat closer than before, a deliberate choice neither of us had made aloud. The air between us was thick with awareness. Every breath, every slight movement seemed amplified. I reached out tentatively, resting my hand near hers on the couch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted slightly, allowing the distance to close, letting the warmth of her presence seep into my awareness. That small, deliberate closeness spoke more than words ever could. I didn't know if I should say anything. I murmured, my voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. But I think I've wanted to be close to you for a long time, more than I even realized. Her gaze softened, her lips curving into a tender, reassuring smile. I know, she said softly. And I feel it too. I felt it for a while, though I didn't want to rush anything or make things complicated. The honesty in her voice, the calm confidence tempered by vulnerability, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was no dramatic declaration, no explosive confession. Only truth, gentle and deliberate, acknowledged and accepted. We had both navigated hesitation, reflection, and subtle tension, and now it had led us here. A shared understanding that was both exhilarating and safe. I reached out slowly, taking her hand in mine. The warmth of her skin, the delicate pressure of her fingers, sent a quiet thrill through me. She leaned slightly closer, letting her head tilt toward mine, and the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the soft evening air. It was intimate yet wholly appropriate, a small, meaningful act of connection. We talked then quietly about what this meant, about the age difference, about boundaries, about taking things slowly. And in that conversation, there was no rush, only a deliberate, shared commitment to explore what had grown between us. The slow-burn tension that had built over hours of subtle gestures and unspoken emotions finally transformed into something tangible. Trust, desire, and connection coexisting in perfect balance. As the night deepened, we sat side by side, hands entwined, shoulders brushing gently. Every laugh, every glance, every shared pause felt like a quiet affirmation of what had begun. The room, once ordinary, now felt intimate and alive, a space that held the energy of two people who had discovered something rare. And in that stillness, with her hand in mine and her gaze meeting mine in unspoken agreement, I realized the slow burn had reached its culmination. We didn't need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. The subtle touches, lingering glances, quiet laughter, and mutual understanding had been enough. We were together, not in a whirlwind, not in a rush, but in a deliberate, gentle embrace of what we felt. And for the first time in hours, I let myself exhale, knowing that this connection, fragile, tentative, and profound, had found its home. Love letter: if this slow burn story touched you, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves age gap romances and heartfelt connections. Don't forget to comment below. I'd love to hear which moment between them gave you butterflies the most.